After the botched ferry heist, Dutch and the gang are forced to flee Blackwater and attempt to cross the mountains west to evade law enforcement. Not long after taking shelter in the abandoned mining town of Colter, Dutch and Arthur go looking for either John Marston or Micah Bell, both of whom went scouting ahead. Arthur and Dutch find Micah, who informs them of a homestead he found, which appears to have a party going on inside. They stop at the homestead to ask for help, where they encounter members of the O'Driscoll boys. After meeting them, a gunfight breaks out, which results in the deaths of the O'Driscolls. After looting the ranch, they encounter Sadie Adler, whose husband was killed by the O'Driscolls. Taking pity on her condition, they bring her back to camp. Not long after returning, Arthur is asked by Abigail Roberts to find John Marston, who has gone missing. Arthur and Javier Escuela find John seriously wounded and scarred across the face after being attacked by wolves. They bring him back to camp, where he begins to recover. A few days later, Dutch plans an ambush on the O'Driscoll camp, which is situated nearby according to an O'Driscoll they interrogated at the homestead. The gang attacks the camp, and after defeating them, find dynamite and information about a train belonging to Leviticus Cornwall that the O'Driscolls intended to rob. On their way back to Colter, they come across an O'Driscoll that they previously saw being reprimanded by Colm. Arthur volunteers to catch him and succeeds, learning that his name is Kieran. The gang ties him up in the stables, starving him for information. Due to the gang's hasty escape from Blackwater, food and supplies were in short supply. Arthur ventures out with Charles Smith to find some food, during which Charles gives Arthur a bow and tells him that he'll have to use it due to the hand injury which the former sustained during the failed ferry robbery. The two share a friendly conversation, discussing their history both in and outside of the gang, while Charles provides Arthur with some hunting tips. Arthur manages to take down 2 deer, and so he and Charles return to camp with enough food to last the gang for the next few days. In order to fund their escape from the mountains, Dutch has the gang rob the Cornwall train. However, the detonator that the gang plan to use fails, so they have to chase after the train. Arthur, Lenny and Javier jump into the train from above, although Javier falls off immediately and Lenny also slips but manages to grasp onto the carriage. After Arthur helps him up, the two manage to fight their way through the train and slay most of the guards before the rest of the gang arrives and finishes off the remaining few. The gang then use the dynamite to enter the private car, where they manage to find some highly valuable state bonds. Dutch then leaves Arthur to deal with the last 3 guards as he wishes, all of whom had surrendered. Their fate is therefore left to the player. After dealing with them, Arthur rides back to Colter. After the thaw comes in, the gang leaves the mountain for a new location in the Heartlands, near the town of Valentine. Arthur goes to the saloon in Valentine, where he meets Javier, Charles, and later, Bill. A bar fight breaks out after Bill drunkenly attacks someone after entering the saloon. After fighting off some men, Arthur eventually engages a huge burly man named Tommy, who overpowers Arthur and throws him out the saloon window onto the muddy street outside. After a bitter brawl, Arthur defeats him and beats him severely, stopping only when Thomas Downs pleads for him to do so. After the fight has ended, Arthur is called over by Dutch, where he meets Josiah Trelawney again. He learns that Sean Maguire is alive, and they make plans to rescue him. Dutch sends Arthur to accompany Trelawney, Charles Smith and Javier Escuela in rescuing Sean. During the rescue attempt, Arthur takes part in the frontal assault, along with Trelawney and Javier, while Charles scouts from a distance. After a bloody firefight with the bounty hunters, Sean is rescued and the gang members return to camp, throwing a party celebrating his safe return. Arthur also goes on a hunt for a 1,000-pound bear with Hosea, who gives Arthur a raven black Shire horse, of which he can choose to either sell or keep at the stables in Valentine. The two set out to Grizzly's East to find the bear. After setting some bait, the two wait for the bear, who attacks them. Hosea thanks Arthur for saving his life and gives him a map of legendary animals. The two can either part ways or go back to camp together. Arthur proceeds to interrogate the O'Driscoll that the gang captured in the mountains. Dutch calls Bill over to castrate Kieran with burning hot tongs if he doesn't reveal the location of Colm O'Driscoll. Kieran then says that he's at 6 Point Cabin and is accompanied there by Arthur, John and Bill. Upon reaching the hideout, the trio stealthily take out some of the O'Driscolls before a shootout eventually ensues. Arthur enters a cabin in the hope of finding Colm, but is instead surprised by an O'Driscoll goon. Before Arthur can be killed, Kieran appears and fatally shoots the O'Driscoll, saving Arthur's life. Arthur then threatens him after Colm is not there, believing that he set them up. Kieran points out that he wouldn't have saved Arthur's life if that were the case, and, with some more prompting from John and Bill, Kieran is allowed to stay with the gang. Arthur can also go buffalo hunting with Charles at some point during this chapter, and he can also rob the homestead of Ches Porter with Javier. At some point, Arthur will receive a letter from Mary Linton, who asks Arthur to meet her. After reading the letter, Arthur is told by Leopold Strauss that he needs to recover a debt from Thomas Downs, a rancher. Arthur goes to Downs' ranch and confronts Mr. Downs. Thomas says that he is destitute, prompting Arthur to beat him. Eventually, Thomas's wife Edith arrives, saying that her husband is ill and they truly are destitute, leading to Arthur leaving the ranch. Arthur can meet Mary soon afterward, who tells him that her brother Jamie has been inducted into a cult known as the Chelonians. If Arthur agrees to help her, he will find Jamie with them near Cumberland Forest. Arthur scares them off and then chases the escaping Jamie, eventually catching him and shooting the gun out of his hand when he tries to kill himself, before returning him to Mary. After returning from a scouting mission, Lenny Summers tells Arthur in Dutch that Micah started a gunfight in Strawberry after getting drunk and subsequently killed 2 O'Driscolls, which led to his arrest. Before attending to Micah, Arthur brings Lenny to Valentine for a drink to calm his nerves, and both of them get very drunk.
Lenny, where are you? Lenny? Hey, Lenny! Lenny, where are you at?
Once he is sobered up, Arthur heads for Strawberry to rescue Micah. The sheriff refuses to release Micah, so Arthur breaks the bars on his cell and a firefight ensues, with Micah immediately killing his cellmate, who was an O'Driscoll. Arthur says to Micah that they need to leave immediately, but Micah refuses, saying he has something to do. The two are forced to kill almost every lawman in the town, until at last Micah arrives at a house and knocks on the door, kills the man living there and his wife, and retrieves his prized revolvers from them. The two then flee on their horses and fight off the pursuing lawmen, after which Arthur berates Micah for his recklessness, for the unnecessary violence, and going back for the guns. Micah says that he won't return to Dutch until he does something to redeem himself. He asks Arthur to meet him somewhere nearby to carry out a robbery. Afterwards, Arthur goes out to meet Micah, as promised earlier, and so they set out to rob a stagecoach that Micah found out about from his O'Driscoll cellmate. After commandeering the carriage, they are then attacked by O'Driscolls, who try to rob them. Arthur and Micah eventually manage to fight them off from the other side of a river, allowing the two to finally claim the money. Later on, while at camp, Abigail asks Arthur to take Jack Marston fishing at the Dakota River. While there, they are approached by Andrew Milton and Edgar Ross, agents of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Milton reveals that they caught and killed Mac Callender, and tells Arthur that in exchange for turning Dutch in, he will be spared the noose. Arthur angrily refuses and takes Jack back to camp after the agents leave. John contacts Arthur and tells him that he heard of a train that will be moving through Valentine. He suggests that in order to get the train to stop, Arthur should steal a stagecoach carrying Cornwall oil. Arthur can steal the stagecoach and rendezvous with Sean, Charles and John. After putting the stagecoach in front of the train, it screeches to a halt and the gang boards it. Charles deals with the engineer, John goes down the train with a bag for the loot, and Arthur provides some encouragement for those not so willing to give. He then goes looking for Sean, who was supposed to have been dealing with the baggage car, only for him to have gone. Arthur eventually finds him in a tussle with a guard, who Arthur kills. The robbery is then cut short, with the law descending upon them. The 4 gang members are forced to flee and manage to escape the law. John, who thinks they still need more money, talks to Arthur and tells him that he hears of a herd of sheep coming in. He tells Arthur to buy a sniper rifle, and they ride up to a hill, shooting bullets at the ranch hands. They flee, and Arthur corrals the sheep to an auction. The man who runs the auction recognises the sheep and says if they pay him 25% of all profits, he will keep his mouth shut. This sum falls to 18% after John negotiates with him. Arthur and John then go to the nearby saloon where they meet Strauss and Dutch. During the meeting, Leviticus Cornwall and his hired guns capture Strauss and John. Dutch and Arthur rescue them before fighting their way out of the town back to camp. Realizing that they can't stay in the area any longer, Dutch sends Arthur and Charles to investigate Dewberry Creek, a possible camp location suggested by Micah. Arthur and Charles instead discover a German mother and her children, with their father missing. Charles manages to trace the father to Clement's Point, where they fight off some bandits and free him. Arthur returns him to his family, while Charles returns to the others to divert the caravan to Clement's Point, a much better location for camp. Thanks for sticking around to the end, and I hope you enjoyed this video on the story of Arthur Morgan from Red Dead Redemption 2. Thank you always to my subs, and if you'd like to help the channel grow, you can click the join button or sign up to my Patreon.